All right, guys, we're going to look at the boom times of the 1920s and part of what brought on that, part of the economic policy that brought on that economic boom that we see in the 1920s. And a lot of it we're going to talk about relates to taxes. Later on in the chapter, we'll talk about how the booming economy was also artificially created in some ways with the stock market and things like that. But for this, we're going to focus on U.S. tax policy in the 1920s and a little bit before that. The Secretary of the Treasury from 1921 to 1926 was a guy named Andrew Mellon. And we don't really talk about Secretary of Treasuries too often, but this is the one we do talk about. He had a significant impact in shaping the monetary policy of the United States, in particular the tax policy of the United States. And I'll leave it up to you to judge the good or the bad of it in the long run, if you'd like to see this, like things like this take place more today, or if you want to see things kind of go back to a different way. After World War I, there were a lot of people that felt taxes on the wealthy were too high. Taxing the wealthy at a large rate is something that a lot of people talk about. You heard Bernie Sanders talk about it on the campaign trail. You even heard Hillary say she wanted to do that. And what that rate is that exceeds what too much is on the wealthy is something that is always going to be debated. But as a result of this, what a lot of the wealthy people were doing was they were hiding their money. They were putting it in places that the government couldn't legally get it. So they were putting it in tax-exempt places. And what that means is basically your money goes into a type of account or a type of investment where it doesn't get taxed, where the federal government isn't going to tax it. We see this a lot. People that have, you guys have heard of 401ks and 403bs. Those are tax-exempt holdings. People take a certain amount of their paycheck out, they put it into their 401k. That does not get taxed until a much later date. And in some cases, there's different types of tax-exempt holdings where you could potentially not get taxed on the money at all. And as a result of this, because the taxes were very high, because the wealthy were shifting their money around into other places, Mellon made the argument that this brought lower returns to the government and it discouraged businesses. It prevented people from, in particular wealthy people, from putting their money anywhere where the government could touch it because it was in their best interest to put it in a place they wouldn't. And if the government can't touch the money, then no matter what a wealthy person is making, the government's going to get nothing from that. So they wanted to look to make this system work a little bit better and fix it. So Mellon reduced taxes, and most of these taxes were on the wealthy, but keep in mind a lot of the higher taxes in general were already on the wealthy. He eliminated what's called the excess profit tax and the gift tax. Excess profits tax, what that refers to is when the government would particularly do this in wartime. If companies were making such ridiculous profits, the government felt like they would add an extra amount of tax on top. Once an income level reached a certain point, the government would start taking even more money from those individuals. And he also eliminated the gift tax. And what this meant, and we do have the gift tax today, we'll talk about this a little bit, but what this means is if you give somebody money, after a certain point, taxation comes into effect. He reduced excise taxes. Excise taxes are an extra tax that you pay on certain items. Government typically does this to discourage behavior or to tax behavior they know people aren't going to stop. So alcohol has an excise tax on it. Cigarettes have a very large excise tax on it to try to encourage people not to smoke. And then there's the surtax, all right? And this is an added tax. This is a tax on top of a tax. And typically that comes with income and estate taxes. So there were all these different taxes that existed in the 1920s, and Mellon is looking to either reduce them or get rid of something. These are all part of what happened. To give you an idea of just how high taxation was for the wealthy at this time, if you earned $1 million in a year, the federal government's share of that was 66.3%. So 663,000 of that million went to the government, which meant the person that earned the money kept 337 million of it, and the government took the vast majority of it. So by 1926, by the time Mellon's tax cuts had worked their way through, that had been reduced to 200,000. So individuals that made $1 million a year now kept 80% of that money, and the government took 20% of it. That's quite a difference. And that tax policy, some good things happened. Government revenue goes up because people are no longer hiding their money from the government to keep it from being taxed at high, ridiculous rates. Government is bringing more money in. Even though the rate is reduced, the amount of money the government brings in goes up. The national debt goes down. There's a novel idea. They actually were able to bring in so much revenue from these tax cuts, and they actually were able to reduce the debt. This was, a really good part of the economic prosperity of the 1920s. And, wealth and prosperity are increased in a lot of different ways. People were not getting punished anymore for being wealthy to excess. But the bad, a lot of people felt like more debt should have came off. That these taxes spared the rich and it soaked the middle class. That the middle class were getting, they didn't see the tax benefits like the rich did, and as a result of that, there was some criticism there. And also, they felt like this created a very loose monetary policy. That this is, allowed a lot of the excesses that lead to the Great Depression. That if we had a little stricter monetary policy, maybe we wouldn't have these excesses of wealth that led to the economic crash. So we'll talk about this a lot more in class. We'll go over a number of different things, but that is the Mellon tax cuts, and that is, tax policy of the 1920s, and we see a large benefit from that tax policy in general.